Maxwell Briggs stood at the edge of the Vertex Technologies tower, his empire of glass and steel rising 60 floors above Silicon Valley. At just 35 years old, he had accomplished what many tech entrepreneurs only dreamed of, building a multi-billion-dollar company that was the envy of the industry. But today, as he gazed out over the sprawling campus below, his thoughts weren't on celebration, but domination. "The future belongs to the young," Maxwell often told reporters with his trademark smirk. "In tech, if you're over 40, you're practically a dinosaur." This wasn't just talk. It was the foundation of Vertex's corporate culture. Walking through the open concept office floors, you'd be hard-pressed to find an employee over 35. Maxwell had cultivated an environment that worshipped youth, innovation, and image above all else. The morning sunlight gleamed off his custom Italian suit as he strode through the executive floor. His corner office was a testament to his success, minimalist furniture worth more than most people's annual salaries, artwork from emerging artists that would soon be worth millions, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the valley he was rapidly conquering. "Mr. Briggs, your 9 a.m. is waiting in the conference room," his assistant said, handing him a sleek tablet with the day's agenda. "Tell them I'll be there in 15, Maxwell replied without looking up, scrolling through the quarterly reports with a frown forming on his face. The numbers were good, great even, but in Maxwell's world, good was never enough. He demanded exponential growth, breakthrough innovations, and a workforce that would sacrifice everything to deliver them. At Vertex Technologies, job interviews didn't just evaluate skills and experience, they assessed cultural fit, which often translated to whether candidates looked the part. Maxwell had personally rejected qualified applicants for wearing the wrong clothes, having outdated hairstyles, or simply because they seemed too settled. He wanted hungry young talents who would work 18-hour days, sleep under their desks, and live and breathe Vertex. "The new marketing director starts today," his assistant reminded him. 27, Stanford MBA, previously at... "I remember," Maxwell cut her off. "Make sure she's introduced to everyone who matters." In Maxwell's organization, who mattered was carefully calculated. Those who could advance his vision, who embodied the youthful energy he prized, who wouldn't question his methods. The morning executive meeting exemplified Maxwell's leadership style. He paced the length of the conference table, energy radiating from him like a physical force as he outlined his demands for the upcoming quarter. "Our competitors are stuck in last decade's thinking," he told his team, all of whom had perfected the art of enthusiastic nodding. "They're weighed down by legacy employees who can't adapt. That's why we'll win. We're nimble, we're forward-thinking, and we're unafraid to disrupt." What went unsaid, but was clearly understood, was how expendable everyone in the room was. Maxwell had fired executives for missing targets, for questioning his strategies, or simply for failing to maintain the image he demanded. The average tenure of a Vertex executive was less than 2 years. Later that afternoon, Maxwell walked through the engineering department, where rows of young developers hunched over multiple monitors, empty energy drink cans scattered around them. This was the heart of Vertex, where the company's flagship product, an AI-driven enterprise platform called Vertex Core, was developed and refined. "How's progress on the 4.0 release?" Maxwell asked the engineering director, a nervous 29-year-old who had been promoted after his predecessor was unceremoniously let go for suggesting the release timeline was too aggressive. "We're on schedule, Mr. Briggs. The team's been working around the clock." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember, we launch in 6 weeks. No delays." As he continued his walk through the department, he passed by a section where a small team worked somewhat separately from the others. His eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed an older man in the corner, head bent over complex diagrams spread across his desk. The man's silver hair and weathered face stood out sharply against the sea of youth surrounding him. "Who's that?" Maxwell asked quietly, gesturing discreetly toward the man. "That's Henry Freeman," the director replied. "He's been consulting on the core architecture for about 3 years now. He's actually one of the most..." "Why haven't I seen him before?" Maxwell interrupted, irritation creeping into his voice. "He usually works remotely. He's only on site for the final push before major releases." Maxwell's lips pressed into a thin line. The man was clearly in his 60s, maybe even older, a glaring contradiction to everything Vertex represented. And we couldn't find someone younger for that role? The director shifted uncomfortably. He's actually incredibly valuable. He designed some of the foundational systems that... Just make sure he's not front and center when investors visit. Maxwell cut him off again. Doesn't fit the Vertex image. As Maxwell turned to leave, he didn't notice the resigned look on the director's face, nor did he see Henry Freeman briefly glance up from his work, observing the exchange with quiet perceptiveness. Back in his office, Maxwell reviewed the latest competitor analysis. Vertex was leading the market, but several rivals were gaining ground. The pressure to maintain Vertex's position as the industry darling was immense. The upcoming Vertex Core 4.0 release wasn't just another update. It represented a complete overhaul of their core technology, promising capabilities that would cement their dominance for years to come. The board is very excited about the 4.0 release, his chief financial officer reported during their afternoon meeting. They're projecting a 15% stock bump on announcement day alone. Maxwell leaned back in his chair. They should be excited. This release will make our competition irrelevant overnight. What Maxwell Briggs didn't know, what he couldn't possibly anticipate, was that his carefully constructed empire was about to face its greatest challenge, and that the very values he'd built his company on, youth, image, and relentless ambition, would soon be tested in ways he never imagined. As the day came to a close, Maxwell stood once more at the window of his office, watching as the valley below began to light up against the darkening sky. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, within his control. He liked that feeling, the sense that he had built something untouchable, unassailable. A kingdom where age was a liability and experience was less valued than potential. Tomorrow we'll review the marketing campaign for the launch, he told his assistant as she prepared to leave for the evening. I want something bold, something that shows we're not just improving technology, we're defining the future. With a satisfied smile, Maxwell Briggs turned away from the window. In 6 weeks, Vertex Core 4.0 would launch, and the tech world would once again bow to his vision. What could possibly go wrong? Henry Freeman arrived at Vertex Technologies headquarters at precisely 7:15 a.m., 2 hours before most employees would begin trickling in. At 68, his morning routine hadn't changed in decades. Awake before dawn, a strong cup of black coffee, and at his desk early enough to gather his thoughts before the chaos of the day began. The security guard nodded with familiar respect as Henry swiped his access card, a gesture of recognition rarely afforded to Vertex's rotating cast of young employees. Unlike the polished tech professionals who filled Vertex's halls, Henry dressed simply: khaki pants, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and comfortable shoes built for function rather than fashion. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of years spent peering at schematics and computer screens. The leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder had been with him for 20 years, its worn edges containing more engineering wisdom than most of Vertex's library of digital documentation. Henry made his way to his workspace in the far corner of the engineering floor, a deliberate choice that kept him removed from the constant buzz of activity and allowed him to focus on the complex problems that had become his specialty. His desk stood out among the sleek, minimalist workstations that surrounded it. While others displayed trendy gadgets and startup memorabilia, Henry's space contained carefully organized notebooks, technical references, and a few black and white photos of early computing pioneers who had inspired his career. The journey that brought Henry Freeman to Vertex had been long and distinguished, though few at the company knew its details. After graduating from MIT in the late 1970s, he had been part of the teams that developed early operating systems at Bell Labs, designed critical components for NASA during the shuttle program, and helped pioneer cloud computing before it had a name. His patents numbered in the dozens, his published papers in the hundreds, yet he carried this legacy with a humility that rendered him nearly invisible in Vertex's achievement-obsessed culture. 3 years ago, when Vertex was struggling with fundamental architecture issues in their core product, a desperate engineering director had reached out to Henry through an old colleague. What was meant to be a 2-week consulting arrangement had stretched into years as Henry quietly became the architectural backbone of Vertex Core, the product that had catapulted Vertex to its industry-leading position. "Morning, Henry," called out May, one of the few senior engineers who recognized Henry's value. At 36, she was considered a veteran at Vertex, preserved from Maxwell's youth purges by her exceptional coding skills and irreplaceable knowledge of the system. "Good morning, May," Henry replied with a warm smile. "How's that authentication module coming along?" "Still hitting that throughput bottleneck we discussed yesterday. I've tried 3 different approaches, but nothing's getting us to the performance target." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Let me finish my system review, and we'll take a look together. I have some ideas that might help." This was Henry's typical day, quietly solving the problems that stumped Vertex's brilliant but inexperienced team. He never sought credit, never made a show of his contributions. When younger engineers implemented his suggestions and received accolades from management, Henry would simply nod with satisfaction and move on to the next challenge. The Vertex Core 4.0 release represented Henry's most significant contribution to the company. What the marketing team would soon promote as a revolutionary breakthrough had actually begun 18 months earlier as Henry's proposal to completely rethink the system's foundation. Working nights and weekends, often alone, he had prototyped a new architecture that would make the platform more powerful, more flexible, and more secure than anything on the market. As the morning progressed, Henry methodically worked through his task list, occasionally fielding questions from engineers who had learned that a quiet conversation with the old guy in the corner could save them days of frustration. By lunchtime, he had resolved 3 critical issues that had been blocking progress and sketched out solutions for several more. "You should join us for lunch someday, Henry," said Raj, a 25-year-old developer who had recently begun to appreciate Henry's depth of knowledge. "The team's heading to that new fusion place down the street." Henry smiled. "Thanks for the invitation, but I'm comfortable with my routine. Maybe another time." What Henry didn't say was that he preferred the solitude of his lunch hour, a chance to read technical journals or work through complex problems without interruption. The social dynamics of Vertex, with its cliques and competitive undercurrents, held little appeal for a man who had spent his career focused on the elegant beauty of well-designed systems rather than corporate politics. In the early afternoon, as Henry was deep in thought over a particularly challenging optimization problem, he noticed an unusual stir of activity. Maxwell Briggs was making one of his rare visits to the engineering floor, surrounded by his usual entourage of anxious executives. Henry observed silently as the young CEO strode through the department, offering superficial praise and making demands that would send teams scrambling for days. When Maxwell's gaze briefly passed over Henry, there was a moment of curiosity followed by visible dismissal. Henry recognized the look. He had seen it countless times throughout his career as Silicon Valley's culture shifted toward worshiping youth. What once would have stung now barely registered. Henry knew his worth wasn't measured in appearances or perceptions. As Maxwell departed, the engineering director stopped by Henry's desk. "The 4.0 architecture review is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Maxwell will be there, along with the executive team." Henry nodded. "I'll prepare a technical summary. Will you need me to present, or should I just be available for questions?" The director hesitated. "Maybe just be available in the background. You know how these meetings go, more about optics than substance." "I understand," Henry replied, recognizing the subtext. His presence would be essential for answering the difficult technical questions, but he wouldn't be featured prominently. That role would go to younger team members who fit the Vertex image. As the day wound down and the office gradually emptied, Henry remained at his desk, meticulously reviewing the core components that would be showcased in tomorrow's meeting. The system he had architected was beautiful in its elegance, powerful in its simplicity. Despite his treatment at Vertex, he took immense pride in this creation. Walking to his modest sedan in the nearly empty parking garage, Henry reflected on his career journey. The technological revolutions he had witnessed, the brilliant minds he had collaborated with, the problems he had solved, these were the rewards that mattered to him, not corner offices or executive titles. What Henry Freeman couldn't know was that the coming days would force him into an uncomfortable spotlight, one that would challenge not only how Vertex saw him, but how he saw himself after decades in an industry that increasingly valued youth over wisdom and image over substance. The morning of the architecture review dawned with an atmosphere of anticipation at Vertex Technologies. Conference Room A, reserved for only the most significant company meetings, was being prepared with meticulous attention to detail. The sleek glass table was polished to perfection, each chair precisely aligned, and the massive display screens calibrated to showcase the revolutionary Vertex Core 4.0 platform in all its glory. This wasn't just another product update, it was the centerpiece of Vertex's future. Henry Freeman arrived early as usual, settling into a corner of the room with his well-worn notebook and a stack of technical documentation. He had spent half the night refining his notes, identifying potential questions, and ensuring every aspect of the architecture could be clearly explained. Though he knew his role today would be minimal, his sense of responsibility to the project remained absolute. As the room filled with executives and senior engineers, the energy shifted. Conversations became hushed, postures straightened, eyes darted nervously toward the door. Maxwell Briggs was known for making dramatic entrances, and today was no exception. He strode into the room exactly 2 minutes late, enough to ensure everyone was waiting, but not so long as to waste his precious time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maxwell announced, taking his position at the head of the table, "today we review the future of Vertex Technologies. Vertex Core 4.0 isn't just an upgrade, it's a revolution. And in 6 weeks, our competitors will be scrambling to catch up to what we've accomplished." The presentation began with marketing showcasing sleek visuals and ambitious market projections. Next came product management outlining the feature set that would disrupt the enterprise software landscape. Through it all, Henry observed quietly from his corner, noting with professional interest how the technical complexities of the system were glossed over in favor of dramatic claims and flashy demonstrations. When the technical portion of the presentation began, the engineering director took center stage, flanked by 2 younger team leads who had been chosen as the faces of the project. They presented well, having rehearsed extensively, but Henry noticed Maxwell's attention beginning to wander as they delved into the system architecture. "Bottom line it for me," Maxwell interrupted, cutting off an explanation of the platform's innovative data handling capabilities. "How much faster? How much more scalable? Give me numbers I can take to the board." The team scrambled to adjust, pulling up benchmark slides that had been scheduled for later in the presentation. Initial tests show throughput improvements of 300% and latency reduced by 70% compared to our current release, one of the team leads explained. Maxwell nodded approvingly. "Now, that's what I want to hear. This is exactly the kind of breakthrough innovation that defines Vertex." The meeting continued smoothly until a seemingly innocent question from the chief financial officer derailed the carefully orchestrated presentation. "What about the security audit? Do we have those results yet?" A sudden tension filled the room. The security audit had been scheduled for completion 2 days ago, but no one had circulated the results. The engineering director cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We received the preliminary report yesterday afternoon. The team is still analyzing the findings." Maxwell's expression darkened. "And? What did they find? Why am I just hearing about this now?" After an uncomfortable silence, the security lead spoke up. "The audit identified a potential vulnerability in the new authentication framework. It's significant. Under certain conditions, it could allow unauthorized access to customer data." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Maxwell's face flushed with anger as he processed the implications. A security vulnerability of this magnitude, discovered 6 weeks before launch, could be catastrophic. "How did this happen?" Maxwell demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "And, more importantly, how quickly can it be fixed?" The engineering team exchanged nervous glances. "We're still assessing the scope," the director admitted. "The issue appears to be deeply integrated with the core architecture. It's not a simple patch." Maxwell slammed his hand on the table. "Unacceptable. This launch cannot be delayed. The board, our investors, the entire market is expecting Vertex Core 4.0 in 6 weeks. Fix it." From his corner, Henry had been rapidly flipping through his documentation, connecting the dots between the described vulnerability and the system's architecture. He had warned about potential security implications of one particular design decision months ago, but his concerns had been set aside in favor of speed and functionality. "Mr. Briggs," the engineering director ventured cautiously, "fixing this properly could require significant architectural changes. We might need to consider adjusting the timeline." "The timeline is not negotiable," Maxwell stated flatly. I don't care what it takes. All-nighters, double the team, triple the resources. This gets fixed without delaying the launch. As the meeting devolved into a tense back and forth about possible solutions, Henry quietly sketched out a potential approach in his notebook. Years of experience had taught him that most problems, even seemingly catastrophic ones, could be solved with the right perspective and methodical thinking. After the executives filed out, the engineering team remained, shell-shocked by the morning's revelations. The director paced anxiously, muttering about impossible timelines and career-ending failures. May I see the full security report? Henry asked quietly, approaching the group. The team lead handed over his tablet with the detailed findings. Henry spent several minutes reviewing the document, his expression growing increasingly serious. The vulnerability was indeed significant, more complex than the team had initially presented to Maxwell. I think I understand the issue, Henry finally said. It's related to the token validation process in the new microservices architecture. It's subtle, but potentially devastating if exploited. Can it be fixed in time? The director asked desperately. Henry considered the question carefully. Not easily. This isn't a bug. It's a fundamental design flaw that affects multiple components. Rushing a fix could actually create more vulnerabilities. The news spread quickly throughout the engineering department. Emergency meetings were convened, regular work was deprioritized, and a war room was established to tackle the crisis. Through it all, Henry methodically analyzed the problem, working quietly while others frantically searched for quick solutions. As evening fell and most of the executive team had departed, Maxwell returned to the engineering floor, his face a mask of controlled fury. The company's future hung in the balance, and someone would be held responsible. He surveyed the room of anxious engineers, his gaze eventually settling on Henry Freeman, the oldest person present, a relic from another era who somehow still occupied a place in his cutting-edge company. Little did Maxwell know that the crisis now threatening Vertex's future would soon bring him face-to-face with prejudices he didn't even recognize he held, and force a reckoning that would change the company forever. 48 hours after the discovery of the security vulnerability, Maxwell Briggs called an all-hands emergency meeting with the engineering leadership team. The executive boardroom on the top floor, a space typically reserved for meetings with investors and board members, had been chosen deliberately. Maxwell understood the power of environment in establishing authority, and today he needed every advantage. The tension in the room was palpable as the engineering team filed in, dark circles under their eyes testifying to the sleepless nights spent trying to solve the security crisis. The gleaming mahogany table, usually arranged to foster collaboration, had been reconfigured with Maxwell's chair elevated slightly above the others, a subtle but unmistakable power move. Henry Freeman entered quietly, taking a seat near the back. He carried with him a folder containing his analysis of the vulnerability and 3 potential approaches to addressing it. None were quick fixes, but after careful consideration, he believed they represented the most viable paths forward. Unlike his younger colleagues, Henry's expression remained calm. In his decades-long career, he had weathered many such crises. Panic, he knew, was the enemy of clear thinking. 2 days, Maxwell began without preamble, his voice dangerously controlled. 2 days since we discovered a catastrophic flaw in our flagship product, and I'm still waiting to hear a solution. He paced slowly behind his chair, making eye contact with each person in turn. What I'm hearing instead are excuses about complexity and timeline adjustments. The engineering director attempted to respond. Mr. Briggs, we've been working around the clock. The team has made progress in isolating the vulnerability, but the fix is complicated by... I'm not interested in complications, Maxwell cut him off. I'm interested in solutions. Vertex Core 4.0 launches in exactly 5 weeks and 4 days. That timeline is non-negotiable. The product manager cleared her throat. We've discussed the possibility of launching with limited functionality, perhaps disabling the affected modules temporarily while we... Absolutely not, Maxwell slammed his hand on the table. We've already announced the full feature set. Scaling back now would destroy market confidence and give our competitors an opening. That's not an option. The room fell silent as the team exchanged worried glances. They had exhausted every quick fix scenario and come up empty. The vulnerability was too deeply embedded in the architecture to permit a simple solution. Maxwell's gaze swept the room, landing finally on Henry. You, the consultant, you've been unusually quiet. What's your assessment? All eyes turned to Henry, who straightened slightly in his chair. He opened his folder with deliberate calm. After thorough analysis, I've identified the root cause of the vulnerability. It stems from an architectural decision made early in the development process, specifically the approach to cross-service authentication. Henry proceeded to explain the technical details in clear, precise terms. His explanation was neither condescending nor unnecessarily complex, a skill refined through decades of translating engineering concepts for non-technical executives. I've outlined 3 potential approaches, Henry continued, raising his folder. Each involves significant architectural modifications, but approach 2 offers the best balance of security and implementation speed. With adequate resources, we could implement it within 3 weeks, followed by 2 weeks of rigorous testing before launch. Maxwell's expression darkened. 5 weeks total? That's cutting it dangerously close to launch day. Yes, Henry acknowledged without hesitation. But rushing a security fix of this magnitude would be inadvisable. The potential damage from a data breach far exceeds the impact of a slight delay. A murmur of agreement rippled through the engineering team, quickly silenced by Maxwell's glare. Who made the original architectural decision? Maxwell demanded, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. The room fell silent. Many present knew that the decision had actually been made by a former team lead who had been let go months ago after repeatedly clashing with Maxwell over resource allocations. However, as current architecture lead, the responsibility fell to one of the younger engineers present. I approved the final design, he admitted reluctantly. Maxwell's focus snapped back to Henry. And you? Where were you when this flawed architecture was being designed? Isn't architectural guidance part of your consulting role? Henry met Maxwell's gaze steadily. I raised concerns about this specific approach in the planning phase. My recommendations were documented in the architecture review from February. The engineering director shifted uncomfortably. That's correct. There were some differences of opinion regarding the authentication approach. The team ultimately decided to prioritize performance and ease of implementation. Maxwell's expression shifted from anger to something more calculating. So what you're telling me is that this crisis could have been avoided if the team had listened to him. He gestured dismissively toward Henry, making the pronoun sound like an insult. That's an oversimplification, but essentially yes, the director admitted. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then Maxwell laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Well, isn't that interesting? We're now expected to trust the future of Vertex Technologies to someone who looks like he belongs in a retirement home rather than a tech company. The cruel comment hung in the air, shocking even those accustomed to Maxwell's cutting remarks. Several team members looked down at the table, uncomfortable with the blatant ageism. Henry's expression remained impassive, though a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his awareness of the insult. Mr. Freeman has been instrumental in developing the core architecture, one of the senior engineers ventured cautiously. Has he? Maxwell replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And yet here we are, facing a crisis that threatens everything we've built. He turned directly to Henry, looking him up and down with unconcealed disdain. How old are you anyway? 65? 70? I'm 68, Henry answered simply, refusing to be baited. 68, Maxwell repeated, as though the number itself was offensive. When was the last time you actually wrote production code? Do you even understand modern security protocols, cloud-native architectures? The questions were clearly rhetorical, designed to humiliate rather than elicit information. Henry remained silent, recognizing that nothing he could say would diffuse Maxwell's targeted aggression. This is exactly the problem with bringing in consultants from another era, Maxwell continued, addressing the room at large. They apply outdated thinking to cutting-edge problems. Vertex is about innovation, about staying ahead of the curve. We need forward-thinking engineers, not... He gestured dismissively at Henry. Relics giving us history lessons. The engineering director attempted to redirect the conversation. Perhaps we should focus on evaluating the proposed solutions. I've made my decision, Maxwell interrupted. We're going with a fresh approach. I want a new architecture team assembled immediately. Young, innovative thinkers who understand modern security paradigms. He pointed directly at Henry. Your services are no longer required at Vertex Technologies. A shocked silence fell over the room. Even for Maxwell, firing someone in such a public and humiliating manner was extreme. Mr. Briggs, the engineering director said cautiously, Mr. Freeman has been integral to the Vertex core architecture. Removing him from the project at this stage would what? Maxwell challenged. Force us to think differently? Push us toward more innovative solutions? He straightened his jacket with a decisive gesture. My decision is final. HR will handle the details. He turned to Henry with a cold smile. Thank you for your service, Mr. Freeman. Vertex Technologies is moving in a direction that requires a more contemporary perspective. Henry closed his folder slowly, his dignity intact, despite the public humiliation. I understand, he said simply, rising from his chair. I'll prepare transition documentation for my current responsibilities. As Henry walked calmly toward the door, Maxwell called after him. Let this be a lesson to everyone. At Vertex, we innovate or we leave. There's no room for outdated thinking or outdated people. The door closed quietly behind Henry, leaving a boardroom full of stunned engineers and a CEO whose smugness masked the catastrophic error he had just made. The boardroom door closed behind Henry Freeman with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than a slam would have. For several moments after his departure, the room remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. The engineering team exchanged glances ranging from shocked to appalled, while Maxwell Briggs straightened his custom Italian tie with the satisfied air of someone who believed he'd just demonstrated decisive leadership. Well, Maxwell said briskly, breaking the silence, now that we've cleared out the deadwood, let's get back to solving our actual problem. I want a new architectural approach on my desk by tomorrow morning. As the meeting reluctantly resumed, an almost imperceptible shift had occurred in the room. Engineers who normally competed for Maxwell's attention now responded with minimal enthusiasm. Questions were answered efficiently, but without elaboration. The energy that typically characterized Vertex's meetings had been replaced by a mechanical compliance that Maxwell, in his self-satisfaction, failed to notice. Down in the engineering department, word of Henry's dismissal spread like wildfire. May, one of the senior engineers who had worked closely with Henry, was organizing his workspace when the man himself appeared to collect his few personal belongings. Henry, I'm so sorry, she said quietly. What happened up there was inexcusable. Henry gave her a gentle smile as he carefully packed his weathered leather messenger bag. It's all right, May. I've been in this industry long enough to know how these things go. But it's not all right, she insisted, lowering her voice as other engineers glanced their way. You're the reason Vertex Core works at all. Your architecture is what made version 3.0 possible. Without you, without me, Henry interrupted kindly, Vertex will find its path. Companies always do. He tucked his notebooks, containing invaluable notes accumulated over 3 years, into his bag. The team here is talented. They'll solve the security issue eventually. Eventually isn't soon enough, May replied. We have 5 weeks until launch, and Maxwell just threw out our best chance at fixing this in time. Henry paused, considering his next words carefully. Sometimes people need to learn certain lessons for themselves. Maxwell is young. He has time. As Henry made his way through the open workspace, engineers stood up from their desks, offering quiet words of appreciation and respect. Some had worked with him directly, benefiting from his guidance and experience. Others had merely observed from a distance, recognizing the value he brought, even if company leadership did not. The impromptu farewell procession was a stark contrast to the humiliation Henry had endured in the boardroom. Raj, the young developer who had recently begun to appreciate Henry's mentorship, awkwardly thrust out his hand. They're making a huge mistake, sir. Henry shook the offered hand warmly. Not the first mistake I've seen in this industry, and certainly not the last. Keep asking good questions, Raj. That's more important than having all the answers. By the time Henry reached the elevators, more than a dozen engineers had gathered to see him off. a quiet demonstration that didn't go unnoticed by those watching from management offices. As the elevator doors closed on Henry's dignified figure, a collective sense of loss settled over the engineering department. Back in his office, Maxwell was already moving on, mentally reframing Henry's dismissal as a necessary step in Vertex's evolution. "Get HR to draft the standard separation agreement," he instructed his executive assistant, "and make sure IT revokes all his access immediately." "Yes, Mr. Briggs," the assistant replied, with notably less enthusiasm than usual. "Should I also cancel his consulting contract?" "Obviously," Maxwell replied without looking up from his tablet, "and put out some feelers for a replacement, someone young, forward-thinking, preferably from one of our competitors." Throughout the afternoon, the atmosphere at Vertex headquarters grew increasingly strained. The engineering teams assembled to tackle the security vulnerability found themselves struggling without Henry's institutional knowledge. Discussions that would have benefited from his insights took longer, reached fewer conclusions, and generated more frustration. By evening, when Maxwell made his customary walk through the engineering floor, he noticed the subdued mood, but attributed it to the pressure of the launch deadline. "Remember, people," he announced to the room at large, "Vertex became an industry leader by embracing change and rejecting complacency. Today's decisions ensure tomorrow's success." The words rang hollow, met with perfunctory nods rather than the enthusiastic agreement he was accustomed to receiving. Maxwell frowned slightly but moved on, convinced the team would adjust to Henry's absence within days. What Maxwell failed to understand was the depth of respect Henry had earned among his colleagues. It wasn't just his technical expertise they valued, though that was considerable, but his patience, his willingness to share knowledge without seeking credit, and his calm guidance during difficult projects. These qualities had created a foundation of trust that Maxwell's cavalier dismissal had now fractured. In the war room established to address the security crisis, the newly appointed architecture team was already floundering. Without Henry's comprehensive understanding of the system, they found themselves chasing solutions that addressed symptoms rather than the root cause of the vulnerability. If Henry were here, he'd point out that this approach doesn't account for the microservice dependencies, May commented during one particularly circular discussion. The team lead, conscious of his precarious position following Henry's dismissal, quickly redirected the conversation. "We need to focus on solutions within our current constraints. Let's map out the authentication flow again from first principles." As midnight approached and the engineering floor remained fully staffed, everyone painfully aware of the ticking clock, Maxwell reviewed the day's progress reports in his office. The lack of a clear path forward concerned him, though he would never admit it publicly. The Vertex Core 4.0 launch was more than a product release. It was the centerpiece of Vertex's growth strategy for the next 2 years. His reputation, the company's stock price, and the confidence of major investors all hinged on its success. For a brief moment, as he stared at the technical diagrams he only partially understood, Maxwell felt a flicker of doubt about his decision to dismiss Henry. He quickly suppressed it, reminding himself that decisive leadership sometimes required difficult choices. Henry Freeman represented an outdated approach to technology, or so Maxwell had convinced himself. Vertex would be better without him. In his modest apartment across town, Henry sat at his kitchen table, reviewing a copy of his analysis that he'd brought home days earlier. Though no longer obligated to Vertex, he found his mind returning to the security vulnerability, working through potential solutions out of professional pride and genuine concern for the company's future. Despite Maxwell's treatment, Henry had invested 3 years in Vertex's success and still cared about the outcome. As he made notes in the margins of his diagrams, Henry's phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, expressions of support, questions about his plans, and thinly veiled requests for technical guidance on the problems they now faced without him. He responded kindly but firmly, maintaining the professional boundaries his departure required. What neither Henry nor Maxwell could anticipate was how quickly the consequences of that day's events would unfold, and how dramatically they would reshape both men's futures in the days to come. 24 hours after Henry Freeman's humiliating dismissal, the reality of Maxwell Briggs's catastrophic error began to crystallize. The morning status meeting in the war room had the atmosphere of a funeral rather than a problem-solving session. Bleary-eyed engineers slumped in their chairs, caffeine no longer sufficient to mask their exhaustion after a night of failed attempts to resolve the security vulnerability. "Where do we stand?" asked the engineering director, his own fatigue evident in the dark circles under his eyes. The new architecture lead, a brilliant but inexperienced developer who'd been promoted into Henry's role, pulled up a complex diagram on the main screen. "We've identified 4 potential approaches to addressing the authentication vulnerability. Unfortunately, each one creates cascading issues in other parts of the system." May, who had worked most closely with Henry, couldn't contain her frustration. "That's because we're treating symptoms instead of addressing the root architectural issue." Henry understood how all these components interacted. "Henry is no longer with the company," the director reminded her gently. "We need to work with the resources we have now." As the meeting progressed, it became increasingly clear that the team was missing crucial context. The Vertex core architecture had evolved over 3 years under Henry's guidance, with countless decisions documented only in his meticulous notes he had packed into his leather messenger bag before leaving. "What about the documentation?" asked the product manager, desperate for a solution to present to Maxwell later that day. Surely all of this was documented somewhere. The senior developers exchanged uncomfortable glances. While Vertex had standard documentation procedures, the reality was that much of Henry's insight lived in his head, accumulated wisdom from decades of experience that couldn't be captured in diagrams or wiki pages. "The formal documentation covers the what, but not the why," Raj explained. Henry knew why certain architectural choices were made, what alternatives were considered, and what trade-offs were accepted. That context is, well, it's gone now. By midday, the crisis had deepened. The development team attempted to implement one of their proposed solutions, only to discover that it broke a critical component of the data processing pipeline, a component that Henry had personally designed. "This is ridiculous," the engineering director muttered, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "We've got 50 of the best engineers in Silicon Valley, and we can't figure out how to fix this without one 68-year-old consultant." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the team. Vertex Technologies, a company that prided itself on employing the brightest young minds in tech, had become dependent on the very experience and institutional knowledge that Maxwell Briggs so openly disdained. As afternoon approached, Maxwell summoned the leadership team to his office for a progress update. The meeting was brief and tense, with Maxwell growing increasingly agitated as he realized the lack of substantial progress. "It's been a full day," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Are you telling me we're no closer to a solution than we were yesterday?" "The architecture is more complex than we initially understood," the director explained carefully. Henry Freeman had a unique grasp of the system's interdependencies that we're struggling to replicate. Maxwell's face hardened at the mention of Henry's name. "So now you're saying we can't function without a consultant who was past retirement age? Is that the excuse you're offering for this failure?" No one dared to point out that it was Maxwell himself who had created this predicament. Instead, the team promised to redouble their efforts, knowing privately that they were fighting an increasingly desperate battle against both the technical problem and the ticking clock. Back in the war room, the team decided to take a more systematic approach. "Let's map out everything we know about Henry's contributions to the architecture," suggested May. "Maybe if we reconstruct his thinking, we can figure out how he would have approached this problem." What emerged over the next few hours was a revelation to many of the younger engineers. As they traced Henry's work through the code base, they discovered layer upon layer of elegant solutions to complex problems, many implemented so seamlessly that no one had fully appreciated their sophistication until now. "Look at this authentication module," Raj said with growing admiration. Henry built in 3 layers of fallback protocols that activate automatically if the primary authentication path fails. "I never even noticed this was here, but it's been preventing potential security breaches for months." "And here," added another developer, pointing to a section of code Henry had written nearly 2 years earlier. "He included hooks for exactly the kind of security enhancement we need now. It's like he anticipated this problem long before anyone else saw it coming." The team fell silent as the magnitude of their loss became clear. Henry Freeman wasn't just a contributor to Vertex Core. He was its architectural visionary, the master builder whose blueprint they had all been following, often without realizing it. He designed the foundation, the structural supports, and most of the internal systems, the architecture lead admitted, humbled by the discovery. We've been adding rooms and decorating walls, but Henry built the house. By evening, the situation had become dire enough that Maxwell himself appeared in the engineering department, something he rarely did after business hours. The palpable tension in the room intensified at his arrival, but Maxwell was too focused on the launch crisis to notice. "I need solutions, not excuses," he announced to the exhausted team. "The board is expecting an update tomorrow morning, and I refuse to tell them we're still stuck on a problem that should have been solved already." When no one immediately responded, Maxwell's frustration boiled over. "What is wrong with everyone? Since when does Vertex employ people who can't solve technical challenges?" Finally, the engineering director spoke up, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Briggs, we've spent the day mapping Henry Freeman's contributions to the Vertex core architecture. The security vulnerability is deeply intertwined with core systems that Henry designed. Without his insight, developing a solution that doesn't compromise other aspects of the platform is proving challenging." "So bring in another consultant," Maxwell demanded impatiently. "It's not that simple," May interjected, past caring about the professional risk of contradicting the CEO. "Henry spent 3 years building this architecture. It would take any new consultant weeks just to understand what he created, let alone fix the current issue." Maxwell paced the room, unwilling to acknowledge the implication that firing Henry had been a catastrophic mistake. "Then we'll throw more resources at it, double the team size, bring in engineers from other departments." The architecture lead shook his head. "More people won't help at this point. We need specific expertise, Henry's expertise." For a moment, Maxwell looked as though he might explode in anger. Then, to everyone's surprise, he simply turned and left the room without another word. The team exchanged bewildered glances, uncertain what his abrupt departure meant for them. In his office, Maxwell stared out at the darkening Silicon Valley skyline, facing a reality he had never anticipated. For the first time in his meteoric career, he confronted the possibility that his judgment, his instinct for decisive action that had served him so well, might have led him catastrophically astray. The realization came with another, even more uncomfortable truth. Maxwell Briggs, champion of youth and innovation, had allowed his bias against age to cloud his business judgment. In dismissing Henry Freeman for looking too old, he had removed the linchpin holding Vertex's flagship product together, potentially jeopardizing the company's future in the process. As night fell over Vertex headquarters, the engineering team continued their desperate efforts to understand and recreate Henry's architectural vision. But the absent consultant had left a void that no amount of youthful innovation or technical brilliance seemed able to fill. The missing piece, they were all beginning to realize, wasn't just Henry's knowledge, it was his wisdom, accumulated through decades of experience that Maxwell had so carelessly dismissed as irrelevant. Morning light streamed through the windows of Henry Freeman's modest apartment as he sipped his coffee and reviewed the previous day's events with thoughtful detachment. After nearly 50 years in the tech industry, he had developed a philosophical perspective on its highs and lows. Being publicly humiliated and fired by a CEO half his age certainly qualified as a low, but Henry refused to let bitterness take root. His phone had been buzzing consistently since word of his departure from Vertex spread throughout Silicon Valley's tight-knit engineering community. Former colleagues, professional connections, and even a few Vertex board members had reached out with messages of support and, in several cases, employment opportunities. Henry had responded politely but non-committally to all of them. At 68, he wasn't sure he wanted to dive immediately into another high-pressure corporate environment. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Henry wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at 8 in the morning. Opening the door, he found a courier holding an elegant box, tied with a simple ribbon. "Delivery for Mr. Henry Freeman," the courier announced, handing over the package along with a sealed envelope. Inside his kitchen, Henry carefully opened the envelope first. The heavy cardstock bore the embossed logo of Horizon Systems, Vertex's largest and most formidable competitor. The handwritten note inside was brief but direct. "Mr. Freeman, your contributions to our industry have not gone unnoticed. I would value the opportunity to discuss how your expertise might find a more appreciative home at Horizon. The car will await your convenience until noon. Regards, Catherine Chen, CEO. Henry set the note aside and opened the box, finding an expertly crafted model of Horizon's headquarters. A subtle but unmistakable invitation. Looking out his window, he spotted a sleek black sedan parked at the curb, clearly waiting to transport him to a meeting with Catherine Chen whenever he decided he was ready. Catherine Chen was widely respected in the industry, a brilliant engineer who had risen to leadership through technical excellence rather than marketing savvy. Unlike Maxwell Briggs, who had built Vertex through aggressive growth tactics and carefully crafted image, Chen had established Horizon as a company that valued substance over style. Her personal invitation represented a significant gesture in Silicon Valley terms. Meanwhile, at Vertex headquarters, Maxwell Briggs's morning was quickly deteriorating from bad to catastrophic. The engineering team's overnight efforts had yielded minimal progress on the security vulnerability. Worse, his executive assistant had just delivered news that sent a chill through the normally unflappable CEO. Catherine Chen's office reached out to Henry Freeman first thing this morning, she reported, watching Maxwell's expression carefully. Our sources say they sent a car to his residence. Maxwell's face remained impassive, but his hand tightened around his coffee cup. How reliable is this information? Very. The board has already been informed through back channels. This development elevated the crisis from a technical challenge to an existential threat. Horizon Systems had been aggressively pursuing the same enterprise clients as Vertex, positioning their competing product as the more secure, reliable alternative to Vertex Core. If Henry Freeman joined Horizon, bringing his intimate knowledge of Vertex's architecture and its vulnerabilities, the competitive dynamics could shift dramatically overnight. Maxwell paced his office, calculating angles and implications. What's our exposure if Freeman joins Horizon, legally speaking? His general counsel, summoned immediately for this discussion, looked grim. His consulting agreement included standard non-competes and confidentiality provisions, but they're relatively narrow in scope. We designed them that way deliberately to maintain his independent contractor status and avoid co-employment issues. Meaning he could join Horizon tomorrow if he wanted to, as long as he doesn't directly copy code or disclose specific trade secrets. His knowledge of our architecture, design principles, and even the current security vulnerability, all fair game for him to leverage in a new role. Maxwell slammed his hand on his desk. That's unacceptable. There must be some legal lever we can pull. We could threaten litigation, the counsel suggested without enthusiasm. But frankly, that would likely backfire. Given the public nature of his dismissal and his reputation in the industry, we'd appear vindictive rather than justified. It could actually accelerate damage to our market position. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond Maxwell's control. Within hours of Henry's dismissal, Vertex faced not only a potentially unfixable security flaw, but also the prospect of their architectural mastermind joining their biggest competitor. The board would demand answers, investors would panic if word leaked out, and Maxwell's leadership would face unprecedented scrutiny. Call an emergency executive meeting, Maxwell instructed his assistant, and get me everything we have on Catherine Chen and Horizon's current market strategy. I need to understand what they're planning. As Vertex's leadership team assembled in the boardroom, the same room where Henry had been so publicly humiliated the day before, Maxwell received another concerning update. 3 senior engineers from the Vertex Core team had submitted their resignations that morning, citing ethical concerns about leadership decisions in their departure emails. The exodus had begun, exactly as Maxwell's critics on the board had warned might happen if his aggressive management style crossed certain lines. In an industry where talent was the ultimate currency, Vertex was suddenly hemorrhaging value in the form of departing expertise. Across town, Henry Freeman sat across from Catherine Chen in Horizon's understated but elegant executive dining room. Unlike the flashy opulence of Vertex's headquarters, Horizon's offices reflected Chen's preference for functional sophistication. Natural light, comfortable workspaces, and an atmosphere of focused calm prevailed. I've followed your work for many years, Mr. Freeman, Chen said, pouring tea for them both. Your papers on distributed systems architecture in the early cloud computing era were foundational to much of what we do here at Horizon. Henry nodded appreciatively. Your team has built impressive systems as well. Your approach to security has always been particularly thoughtful. Which brings me to why you're here, Chen continued. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending I don't know what happened at Vertex. News travels quickly in our world. Indeed it does, Henry agreed with a small smile. I'd like to offer you a senior role at Horizon, architectural fellow, with the freedom to work on problems that interest you and mentor our engineering teams. No fixed hours, no arbitrary face time requirements, just your expertise, appropriately valued and respected. The offer was generous, substantially more than Henry had been earning at Vertex, with greater autonomy and explicit recognition of his stature. It was the kind of role typically created for industry luminaries, a professional capstone rather than just another job. I appreciate the offer, Ms. Chen, Henry replied carefully. May I ask what your particular interest is in bringing me on at this specific moment? Chen's direct gaze acknowledged the unspoken question. I won't pretend the timing is coincidental. We're aware that Vertex is facing challenges with their upcoming release. Your insights would certainly be valuable as we position our competing product. Henry nodded thoughtfully. And the board is comfortable bringing on someone my age? I was led to believe I was something of a dinosaur in today's tech landscape. His tone was light, but the question was serious. At Horizon, we value results over optics, Mr. Freeman. My board understands that experience has tangible value, particularly in domains like security architecture, where pattern recognition across decades of technology evolution provides unique insights. Chen set down her teacup. Maxwell Briggs's obsession with youth culture has always struck me as a fundamental misunderstanding of what drives true innovation. Back at Vertex, Maxwell was discovering just how accurate Chen's assessment was. As the executive meeting progressed, the scope of the crisis expanded with each new report. The security vulnerability remained unresolved. Key talent was departing. Horizon was making moves to capitalize on Vertex's weakness. And underlying it all was Maxwell's critical error in judgment, dismissing Henry Freeman at the precise moment when his expertise was most vital. For the first time in his meteoric career, Maxwell Briggs faced the possibility that his leadership philosophy, his core belief in youth over experience, style over substance, might prove to be his undoing. The Vertex Core 4.0 launch that was meant to cement his legacy now threatened to destroy it instead. And Henry Freeman, the outdated engineer Maxwell had so carelessly discarded, suddenly held significant influence over Vertex's future, a reality that would soon force a reckoning neither man had anticipated. Maxwell Briggs had never experienced failure, at least not failure of his own making. Throughout his meteoric rise in Silicon Valley, he had navigated challenges with the confident swagger that had become his trademark. He had outmaneuvered competitors, charmed investors, and built Vertex Technologies into a powerhouse through sheer force of will and an unwavering belief in his own vision. But as he sat alone in his corner office at midnight, 3 days after firing Henry Freeman, Maxwell faced an unfamiliar sensation, genuine fear. The boardroom table had been cleared hours ago after an emergency session that had gone poorly for Maxwell. The board members, initially supportive of his leadership, had grown increasingly concerned as the full implications of the Vertex Core crisis became clear. The security vulnerability remained unresolved. 3 more senior engineers had resigned that afternoon. Industry whispers about Vertex's troubles were growing louder. And perhaps most alarmingly, Horizon Systems had announced an accelerated release of their competing product, scheduled to launch just 1 week before Vertex Core 4.0. This is a mess of your own creation, Maxwell, the board chair had told him bluntly as the meeting concluded. Fix it, quickly, or we'll need to discuss alternative leadership arrangements. The threat wasn't subtle. For the first time since founding Vertex, Maxwell's position was genuinely precarious. The company's stock had already dropped 8% on rumors of the delayed launch, and major clients were calling daily, demanding reassurances about product security. Maxwell stared at his computer screen, reviewing the latest technical update from the engineering team. Despite working around the clock, they had made minimal progress on the security vulnerability. Each attempted solution created cascading problems in other parts of the system. Without Henry Freeman's comprehensive understanding of the architecture, they were essentially working blind, making educated guesses that consistently proved inadequate. The truth Maxwell had been avoiding for days finally crystallized with unavoidable clarity. He needed Henry Freeman. The man he had publicly humiliated and dismissed as too old was now essential to Vertex's survival. And worse yet, Henry was being actively courted by their biggest competitor. Maxwell reached for his phone, scrolling to Henry's contact information. His finger hovered over the call button before he set the phone down again. A direct call would be too easily rejected. The situation required a different approach, one that acknowledged the leverage had shifted entirely to Henry's favor. "Sarah," Maxwell called to his executive assistant, who was still working despite the late hour. "I need Henry Freeman's home address." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Freeman's contact information should be in the HR system. "I know that," Maxwell said impatiently. "Just get it for me and have my car brought around." 20 minutes later, Maxwell's sleek Tesla pulled up to a modest apartment complex in Mountain View, a middle-class neighborhood that seemed worlds away from Maxwell's luxurious Palo Alto estate. The contrast wasn't lost on him as he approached the building, noting the well-maintained but distinctly unglamorous surroundings that Henry Freeman called home. Maxwell pressed the buzzer for apartment 207. No response. He tried again, holding the button longer. Still nothing. After a third attempt, an elderly woman emerged from a neighboring apartment. "If you're looking for Henry, he's not home," she informed him. "Hasn't been around much the last couple of days." Maxwell felt a surge of panic at the implication. Had Henry already accepted Horizon's offer? Was he already working with Catherine Chen to exploit Vertex's vulnerability? "Do you know where he might be?" Maxwell asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. The woman studied him with suspicion. "Are you a friend of his?" The question caught Maxwell off guard. Friend was certainly not the right word for their relationship, particularly after their last interaction. "I'm his employer," he replied, immediately realizing his mistake. "Former employer, from what Henry mentioned," the woman corrected with a knowing look. "He said he'd been let go by some hotshot who thought he was too old to be useful. Would that be you, by any chance?" Maxwell had faced hostile investors, aggressive competitors, and skeptical journalists, but somehow this elderly neighbor's direct question made him more uncomfortable than any boardroom confrontation. "There was a misunderstanding," he managed. "I need to speak with Henry about an urgent matter." The woman seemed unimpressed. "Henry volunteers at the community college on Thursday evenings, teaching computer science to kids who can't afford regular university. Been doing it for years." She glanced at her watch. Class should be finishing up in about half an hour. The information surprised Maxwell. In all the background checks and hiring processes, he had never learned this detail about Henry's life. The idea of an accomplished engineer volunteering his time to teach disadvantaged students didn't fit with Maxwell's preconceived notions about older workers being set in their ways and resistant to giving back. "Which community college?" Maxwell asked. "Foothill College. Engineering building, room 103. The woman turned to go back inside, then paused. "If you're going there to cause him more trouble, young man, you should reconsider. Henry's one of the good ones. We don't have enough people like him left." The drive to Foothill College gave Maxwell unwelcome time to reflect. For the first time, he was forced to confront his own biases about age and experience, biases that had seemed like sound business philosophy until they had pushed his company to the brink of disaster. As Silicon Valley's gleaming office parks gave way to the more modest campus of Foothill College, Maxwell felt increasingly out of place in his designer suit and luxury vehicle. He parked and made his way across the quiet campus, following signs to the engineering building. Through the window of room 103, Maxwell caught his first glimpse of Henry since the boardroom confrontation. The older man was standing at a whiteboard, enthusiastically explaining algorithm concepts to a diverse group of about 20 students, ranging from teenagers to middle-aged adults. The students were engaged, asking questions and nodding along as Henry methodically broke down complex ideas into understandable components. Maxwell stood in the hallway, unexpectedly reluctant to interrupt. He had never seen this side of Henry, the patient teacher, the mentor clearly respected by his students. In the Vertex offices, Henry had always been quiet, focused on his work, rather than seeking attention or accolades. Now, watching him teach with evident passion, Maxwell glimpsed dimensions to the man he had never bothered to discover. As the class concluded and students began packing up their materials, many stopped to speak with Henry individually. Maxwell noticed the genuine connections, a far cry from the transactional relationships that dominated Vertex's corporate culture. Several students expressed personal gratitude, mentioning job interviews or program acceptances that had resulted from Henry's mentorship. Maxwell waited until the last student had departed before stepping into the classroom. Henry was erasing the whiteboard, his back to the door. He turned at the sound of footsteps, his expression registering surprise at seeing Maxwell standing awkwardly in the doorway of the community college classroom. "Mr. Briggs," Henry acknowledged with remarkable composure, "this is unexpected." Maxwell, accustomed to controlling every conversation, found himself temporarily at a loss for words. The carefully prepared speech he had mentally rehearsed during the drive suddenly seemed inadequate, too corporate, too transactional for this setting. "I didn't know you taught," Maxwell finally said, gesturing to the classroom. "There's a lot about me you never asked," Henry replied simply, neither hostile nor particularly welcoming. He continued gathering his teaching materials, seemingly in no hurry to facilitate whatever conversation Maxwell had come for. The power dynamic between them had completely reversed. In the Vertex boardroom, Maxwell had held all the authority, dismissing Henry with casual cruelty. Here, in this humble classroom, where Henry's expertise was clearly valued, Maxwell was the outsider, the one seeking something he had no right to expect. "Vertex needs you," Maxwell admitted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "The security vulnerability. The team can't solve it without your understanding of the architecture." Henry nodded thoughtfully, unsurprised by this development. "I suspected that might be the case. The authentication framework has interdependencies that aren't fully documented." "Will you help us?" Maxwell asked, the direct question stripped of his usual commanding tone. Henry studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That depends, Mr. Briggs. What exactly are you asking for? A consultation? A temporary contract? Or are you merely seeking free advice to extract yourself from a crisis of your own making?" The frank assessment was delivered without malice, but with unflinching clarity. Henry Freeman had nothing left to lose in this interaction, no reason to cushion Maxwell's ego or soften the reality of their situation. The older man waited patiently for an answer, apparently content to let Maxwell struggle with the uncomfortable question. And in that moment, Maxwell Briggs, the celebrated young CEO who had built his empire on youth, image, and relentless confidence, faced the most challenging conversation of his career. A conversation that would require something he had always considered unnecessary in business: genuine humility. Maxwell Briggs had never set foot in a community college classroom before. The fluorescent lighting, the worn linoleum floors, the outdated computers lining the walls, all of it stood in stark contrast to the sleek, design-forward spaces he typically inhabited. Yet there was something unexpectedly compelling about Room 103 of the Foothill College Engineering Building. Unlike the calculated environments of Silicon Valley's tech campuses, designed to project a specific image or elicit a particular response, this room existed purely for learning. It held a simple authenticity that Maxwell, surrounded by Henry's former students, found himself responding to despite his discomfort. "I need to lock up the classroom," Henry said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "If you'd like to continue this conversation, we can talk in the courtyard." Maxwell nodded, following Henry through the building's corridors. Students and faculty members greeted Henry warmly as they passed, many stopping to share brief updates on projects or ask quick questions. With each interaction, Maxwell observed a side of Henry Freeman he had never glimpsed at Vertex: the respected elder, the trusted advisor, the mentor whose opinion was genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. They emerged into a small courtyard where several students were gathered around tables, some studying, others engaged in animated conversations about code and algorithms. Henry led Maxwell to an empty bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, setting down his weathered leather bag with a practiced motion. "Before we get to whatever proposition you're here to make," Henry said, settling onto the bench, "I'm curious. Why did you come yourself? Surely Vertex has people who handle this sort of recovery operation." The question was astute, cutting to the heart of Maxwell's unusual personal appearance. Under normal circumstances, Maxwell would have sent the HR director or the engineering lead to attempt to woo back a departed employee, particularly one he had personally dismissed. His direct involvement signaled the severity of the crisis in ways that Henry clearly recognized. The board insisted, Maxwell admitted, deciding that honesty might serve him better than his usual calculated approach. They believe I created this situation, so I should be the one to fix it. Henry nodded thoughtfully. And what exactly did they tell you to offer me? A substantial consulting fee, stock options, a public apology? The directness of Henry's questions made Maxwell increasingly uncomfortable. He was accustomed to negotiating from positions of strength, not sitting on a worn bench, practically begging for help. All of the above, if that's what it takes, Maxwell replied. The security vulnerability has proven more complex than anticipated. Without your understanding of the architecture, the launch timeline is in serious jeopardy. Henry didn't immediately respond, his attention drawn to a young woman approaching their bench with an expression of barely contained excitement. Mr. Freeman, I got it! The internship at IBM. They just called with an offer, she announced, practically bouncing with joy. Henry's face transformed with genuine pleasure. Maria, that's wonderful news. I knew your project would impress them. It was your recommendation that made the difference, she insisted. The interviewer said they rarely see candidates from community colleges with such a strong understanding of enterprise architecture. The recommendation just got you in the door, Henry corrected gently. Your knowledge and hard work did the rest. He turned slightly toward Maxwell. Maria, this is Mr. Briggs. He's the CEO of a technology company here in the Valley. Maria's eyes widened slightly. Oh, nice to meet you, sir. Are you here recruiting? Because the talent in Mr. Freeman's advanced class is incredible. Before Maxwell could respond, another student joined them, this one a middle-aged man with the weathered hands of someone who had worked in manual labor. Henry, can I get your feedback on my database schema before I submit it? I've implemented those normalization suggestions you made. Of course, Dave, Henry replied. Give me 20 minutes to wrap up here and I'll take a look. Dave nodded gratefully, then glanced curiously at Maxwell before returning to his workstation. Similar interruptions continued for several minutes, students seeking guidance, sharing accomplishments, or simply checking in with their mentor. Maxwell watched with growing fascination as Henry engaged with each one, demonstrating a quality of leadership that Maxwell, for all his success, had never mastered, the ability to make others feel truly seen and valued. You really care about them, Maxwell observed, when they finally had a moment of privacy. Of course I do, Henry replied, as if the question itself was puzzling. Many of these students are working full-time jobs while studying. They're supporting families, overcoming significant barriers. Some are retraining after their previous careers disappeared. Their determination deserves respect. Maxwell glanced around the courtyard, seeing the diverse group of students with new eyes. And you've been teaching here for 12 years, Henry answered, initially just one evening class per semester. It's expanded somewhat since then. The information struck Maxwell as remarkable. Throughout Henry's 3 years of consulting with Vertex, he had never once mentioned this teaching commitment. It hadn't appeared in his resume or been referenced in meetings. This substantial part of Henry's professional identity, clearly a source of deep personal satisfaction, had remained completely invisible to Vertex's leadership. Why didn't you ever mention this? Maxwell asked. Henry's expression contained a hint of amusement. Would it have mattered? Vertex values market disruption and growth velocity. Teaching basic programming concepts to community college students hardly aligns with that ethos. The observation was accurate and delivered without bitterness, a simple statement of fact about Vertex's culture that Maxwell had cultivated and celebrated. Yet sitting in this courtyard, watching Henry's students pursue their dreams with determination, Maxwell felt an unexpected twinge of something like regret. Your students seem very committed, Maxwell noted, watching a group huddled around a whiteboard, debating algorithm efficiencies with surprising intensity. They understand something that's easy to forget in success-obsessed environments like Vertex, Henry replied. Learning is most meaningful when it serves a purpose beyond wealth or status. Most of my students aren't looking to become billionaires or launch unicorn startups. They want stable careers doing work they find interesting that allows them to support their families and contribute something worthwhile. The subtle critique of Silicon Valley's values, and by extension Maxwell's own, wasn't lost on the younger man. In his rise to prominence, Maxwell had embraced and amplified the industry's worship of hypergrowth, disruption, and youth. He had built Vertex in this image, creating a culture that celebrated audacious goals and dismissed more modest ambitions as lacking vision. Yet the scene before him, these diverse students striving for knowledge under Henry's patient guidance, contained a different kind of success story. One that unfolded not in dramatic pivots or explosive IPOs, but in the steady progression of individuals gaining skills that would transform their lives and communities. "You've built something meaningful here," Maxwell acknowledged, surprising himself with the sincerity of the observation. Henry nodded, a hint of pride visible in his expression. "It's certainly not as lucrative as building enterprise software, but it has its compensations." As they sat together in the courtyard, the power dynamic between them continued to shift. Maxwell had arrived expecting to make a business proposition, to leverage Vertex's resources and his own negotiating skills to bring Henry back into the fold. But watching Henry in this environment, seeing the respect and genuine connection he had built with his students, Maxwell began to understand that the older engineer couldn't be approached as merely another asset to be acquired or problem to be solved. For Henry Freeman, unlike the young strivers Maxwell typically surrounded himself with, career advancement and financial incentives were secondary considerations. Respect, purpose, and the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution, these were the currencies that would matter in any negotiation between them. As the sun began to set over the modest community college campus, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Maxwell Briggs faced an uncomfortable realization. To salvage Vertex's future, he would need to offer Henry something beyond money and titles. He would need to offer genuine recognition of the value that experience and wisdom brought to the table, a recognition that challenged the very foundation of Maxwell's leadership philosophy. As the last of Henry's students departed from the courtyard, a different kind of silence fell between the two men. The casual interruptions had provided a convenient buffer, allowing Maxwell to observe Henry in this unexpectedly meaningful environment without confronting the real purpose of his visit. Now, with only the distant sounds of campus life as background, the moment of truth could no longer be postponed. "I owe you an apology," Maxwell said finally, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. In his meteoric rise to success, he had rarely found occasion to admit error, and never to apologize for a personal failing. "The way I spoke to you in that boardroom was inexcusable." Henry studied him with careful consideration, neither rushing to accept the apology nor dismissing it outright. "May I ask what exactly you're apologizing for, Mr. Briggs? For firing me? For doing so publicly? Or for something else entirely?" The question caught Maxwell off guard. He had expected either immediate forgiveness, a response that would have made this uncomfortable conversation easier, or bitter rejection. Henry's measured inquiry instead forced him to examine his own actions with greater specificity than he had prepared for. "All of it," Maxwell began, then stopped himself. "No, that's not good enough, is it? I'm apologizing for dismissing your expertise based on your age, for humiliating you in front of your colleagues, for making assumptions about your capabilities that were not only unfair but, as it turns out, catastrophically wrong." Henry nodded slightly, acknowledging the specificity. "Those are actions. What about the thinking behind them?" Maxwell shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "What do you mean?" "I'm curious if you understand why you made those choices," Henry clarified. "Was it simply a momentary lapse in judgment during a stressful situation, or was it a reflection of deeper beliefs about age and value?" The question struck at something fundamental. Maxwell had built his business philosophy, indeed his entire leadership identity, around the worship of youth, innovation, and disruption. He had cultivated Vertex's aggressive hiring practices that favored young graduates over experienced professionals, explicitly seeking to build a company unburdened by outdated thinking. Henry was asking him to examine not just a single poor decision, but the core values that had guided his career. "I've always believed that youth drives innovation," Maxwell admitted. that fresh perspectives unencumbered by how things have always been done lead to breakthrough thinking. I built Vertex on that principle. And now? Henry prompted quietly. Maxwell looked across the courtyard, where a few students still huddled over their projects in the fading light. Now, I'm sitting in a community college watching students half my age learn from someone twice my age and wondering how many other false assumptions I've built my success upon. The raw honesty of the statement surprised them both. Maxwell hadn't planned such a vulnerable admission, yet the setting, so far removed from the carefully curated environments where he typically operated, seemed to demand a different kind of conversation. Experience doesn't make innovation impossible, Henry observed after a thoughtful pause. It just changes its nature. Your engineers create brilliant solutions, but sometimes they solve problems that were addressed decades ago because they don't know the history. That's not efficiency. It's reinventing the wheel. Maxwell considered this perspective. I never thought of institutional knowledge as an innovation accelerator. Most don't, Henry agreed. It's easier to dismiss experience as an obstacle rather than recognize how it might be leveraged, especially in an industry obsessed with the new. A group of evening students walked past, their conversation about database normalization drifting over. Maxwell watched them thoughtfully before turning back to Henry. I made a terrible mistake, he acknowledged, his voice quieter than usual. Not just a business error, though the board would certainly characterize it that way. I treated you with disrespect you didn't deserve, based on prejudices I didn't even recognize I held. Henry's expression softened slightly. I appreciate that acknowledgement. It can't have been easy for someone in your position. It's not, Maxwell admitted. I've built my entire identity around being right, about technology, about business strategy, about people. Being this wrong, it forces questions I'm not comfortable facing. Growth rarely happens within our comfort zones, Henry observed without judgment. In my experience, our most significant learning often follows our most painful mistakes. The simple wisdom of the statement resonated with Maxwell in ways that the latest management theories and business bestsellers never had. Here was a perspective born not from chasing the next trend, but from decades of observing patterns across technological revolutions and market cycles. Vertex needs you, Maxwell said, returning to the primary purpose of his visit. The security vulnerability has implications beyond what the team initially understood. Without your architectural knowledge, we're looking at a significant delay, possibly a complete redesign of key components. And Horizon Systems is positioning to capitalize on that delay, Henry noted, demonstrating his understanding of the competitive landscape. Maxwell nodded, unsurprised that Henry had already connected these dots. Catherine Chen has approached you. She has, Henry confirmed, with a generous offer and considerable autonomy. The confirmation sent a chill through Maxwell. The prospect of Henry taking his knowledge to their largest competitor would be devastating for Vertex's market position, potentially triggering a client exodus that could take years to recover from. What would it take to bring you back? Maxwell asked directly. Henry considered the question carefully. I'm not sure returning to Vertex is the right move, for either of us. We can match whatever Horizon offered. Double it if necessary, Maxwell pressed, falling back on the negotiation tactics that had served him well in countless business deals. This isn't about money, Henry replied with quiet dignity. I've lived modestly my whole career. My apartment is paid for, my needs are simple, and I find genuine fulfillment in my teaching. What would I do with a sudden windfall at 68? Maxwell struggled to comprehend this perspective. In his world, compensation was the primary measure of value and the most straightforward lever in any negotiation. The idea that money might be largely irrelevant to Henry's decision-making process left him momentarily adrift. Then what? He asked finally. What would matter to you? Henry looked at Maxwell with unexpected compassion, the kind a teacher might show a struggling student finally asking the right question. Respect, not just for me personally, but for what I represent. A recognition that experience has value in its own right, not as a poor substitute for youth and energy, but as a different and complementary resource. I can promise you that, Maxwell began earnestly. Can you? Henry interrupted gently. Because that would require more than a policy change or a new position title. It would mean fundamentally rethinking the culture you've built at Vertex, a culture that explicitly celebrates youth over experience, that treats age as a liability rather than an asset. The challenge hung in the air between them. Maxwell had come seeking a quick solution to Vertex's immediate crisis, but Henry was pushing for something more profound, a reevaluation of the principles that had guided Maxwell's leadership and shaped Vertex's identity in the marketplace. As darkness settled over the campus, security lights flickered on around the courtyard, casting both men in a gentle glow that softened the visible differences between them. In that moment, despite the 4 decades separating them in age and the vast differences in their professional experiences, they shared something essential, a recognition that this conversation had implications far beyond a single security vulnerability or product launch. "I need time to consider your perspective," Maxwell said finally, with uncharacteristic humility. "But Vertex doesn't have time. Our customers, our employees, our investors, they're all depending on finding a solution now, not after I've completed some personal journey of enlightenment." Henry nodded, understanding the practical reality behind Maxwell's words. Sometimes, the most important changes begin with the smallest steps, taken under the most difficult circumstances. As they sat together in the quiet courtyard, an unlikely pair connected by crisis and circumstance, the path forward remained uncertain. But something had shifted between them, a mutual recognition that had been absent in their previous interactions at Vertex. Whether it would be enough to resolve the immediate crisis, let alone address the deeper cultural issues Henry had identified, remained to be seen. The following morning found Maxwell Briggs and Henry Freeman in a small, nondescript coffee shop halfway between Vertex headquarters and Foothill College. The neutral location had been Henry's suggestion, a deliberate choice to conduct their conversation on equal footing rather than in Maxwell's power-centered executive office or Henry's academic domain. Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the steam rising from their coffee cups as they faced each other across a worn wooden table. "I've spent the night considering your situation," Henry began, his voice measured and calm, "and my potential role in addressing it." Maxwell leaned forward slightly, his usual impatience tempered by the humbling revelations of the previous evening. The crisis at Vertex had only intensified overnight. Another senior engineer had resigned, and preliminary reports suggested that news of the security vulnerability had begun leaking to industry analysts. The company's stock had dropped another 3% in pre-market trading. "Before I outline my conditions," Henry continued, "I want to be clear about something. I harbor no resentment towards you personally, Mr. Briggs. Your actions reflected values widespread in our industry, values that prioritize youth over experience, disruption over continuity, and image over substance. You merely exemplified them more explicitly than most." The observation contained neither accusation nor absolution, simply an assessment delivered with the clinical precision that characterized Henry's technical work. Maxwell found himself nodding in acknowledgement, accepting the framework Henry had established for their negotiation. "I appreciate your perspective," Maxwell replied, "and I'm prepared to offer whatever compensation is necessary to bring you back to Vertex temporarily to address the security crisis." Henry took a deliberate sip of his coffee before responding. "My first condition isn't about compensation. It's about acknowledgement. If I return to Vertex, it must be with a public recognition of my role and contributions, not hidden away in a back room where I might embarrass your youth-focused brand image." Maxwell shifted slightly in his chair. The request directly challenged Vertex's carefully cultivated public identity. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A formal announcement of my return as Chief Architecture Advisor, with appropriate communication both internally and to key clients and partners. No minimizing my age or experience, in fact, explicitly acknowledging the value they bring to addressing the current situation." The request was reasonable yet radical in the context of Vertex's culture. Maxwell considered the implications. "The board will have concerns about messaging inconsistency. I imagine they'll have greater concerns about a failed product launch and client exodus," Henry observed mildly. "But that's for you to navigate. My condition stands." Maxwell nodded slowly. "What else?" "My second condition addresses the underlying culture that created this situation," Henry continued. I propose the establishment of a formal mentorship program within Vertex's engineering department, pairing experienced engineers, including those you've previously overlooked due to age, with your younger talent. You want me to hire more senior engineers? Maxwell clarified, the strain evident in his voice. I want you to recognize and leverage the experience that already exists within your organization and the broader industry, Henry corrected. This isn't about quotas or token positions. It's about creating structures that value institutional knowledge and facilitate its transfer to the next generation. Maxwell considered the proposal. The mentorship program represented more than a personnel shift. It challenged the fundamental philosophy that had guided Vertex's hiring and development practices since its founding. Yet he couldn't deny that the current crisis had exposed critical gaps in the company's approach to building and maintaining complex systems. That would require significant cultural and operational changes, Maxwell acknowledged. Yes, Henry agreed simply. It would. And your third condition? Henry's expression grew more serious. A comprehensive review and revision of Vertex's hiring practices, eliminating age-based discrimination in both explicit policies and implicit behaviors. I want an independent audit of recruitment, promotion, and retention patterns, with regular reporting to the board on progress toward building a more age-diverse workforce. The coffee shop had begun to fill with morning commuters, their conversations creating a gentle background hum that contrasted with the intensity of the negotiation unfolding at the corner table. Maxwell took a moment to process Henry's final condition, recognizing it as the most far-reaching and potentially disruptive to Vertex's established practices. You're asking for fundamental changes to how we operate, Maxwell said finally, changes that go well beyond resolving the current security crisis. I am, Henry confirmed without apology, because the security vulnerability isn't the disease, it's a symptom. The real problem is a culture that systematically devalues experience and overlooks the contributions of those who don't fit a particular mold. You can patch this specific issue without addressing the underlying cause, but you'll inevitably face similar crises in the future. Maxwell ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from the normally composed CEO. The board expects me to bring you back to fix the immediate problem. They're not prepared for a comprehensive overhaul of company culture. Then you'll need to prepare them, Henry replied evenly. That's what leadership is, isn't it? Not just responding to crises, but preventing them through strategic vision and courageous action. The subtle challenge in Henry's words wasn't lost on Maxwell. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on bold decision-making and disruptive thinking. Now, Henry was effectively asking whether those qualities extended beyond market strategy to the harder work of organizational transformation. And if I agree to these conditions, Maxwell asked, you'll return to Vertex and help us resolve the security vulnerability? Henry nodded. I'll commit to seeing the Vertex Core 4.0 launch through to completion, working directly with your engineering team to address not just the immediate vulnerability, but the architectural foundations that created it. And your discussions with Horizon Systems will be placed on hold pending the outcome of our arrangement, Henry confirmed, though I should note that Catherine Chen's offer remains open and doesn't require the kinds of changes I'm asking of you. The implied leverage was clear. Henry had options that Maxwell did not, a reversal of the power dynamic that had characterized their previous relationship at Vertex. The younger CEO found himself in the unfamiliar position of needing something he couldn't simply acquire through financial resources or business maneuvering. Maxwell took a deep breath, weighing the magnitude of Henry's conditions against the immediate crisis facing Vertex. The security vulnerability threatened the company's market position, client relationships, and stock value. Without Henry's expertise, the path to resolution remained uncertain at best, catastrophic at worst. Yet accepting his conditions meant committing to changes that would fundamentally alter Vertex's identity and Maxwell's own leadership philosophy. I'll need to discuss your conditions with the board, Maxwell said finally. Some aspects may require modification or phased implementation. I understand, Henry replied, but my core requirements aren't negotiable. I won't return to an environment that devalues experience or treats age as a liability. Those days are behind me. The quiet dignity in Henry's statement resonated with something shifting within Maxwell. a growing recognition that his previous certainties about youth, innovation, and leadership might require reevaluation. The smooth confidence that had carried him through his meteoric rise felt suddenly less stable, challenged by Henry's measured wisdom and the undeniable reality of Vertex's current predicament. "I'll present your conditions to the board this afternoon," Maxwell committed, extending his hand across the table, "and advocate for their acceptance." Henry considered the offered hand for a moment before accepting it with a firm grip that belied his age. "I appreciate your willingness to consider a different path forward, Mr. Briggs. It suggests there may be hope for both Vertex and the industry as a whole." As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Henry returning to his teaching responsibilities and Maxwell to the executive offices where difficult conversations awaited, both men recognized that this negotiation represented something larger than a business arrangement. It was, in its way, a potential inflection point in the ongoing dialogue between youth and experience, innovation and wisdom, disruption and continuity. Whether Vertex and Maxwell himself could successfully navigate this transition remained to be seen. But the first tentative steps had been taken, prompted by crisis, but potentially leading towards something more valuable than either man had initially imagined. Henry Freeman's return to Vertex Technologies 3 days later marked a visible shift in the company's atmosphere. The engineering floor, which had been operating under a cloud of anxiety and uncertainty since the discovery of the security vulnerability, stirred with cautious optimism as Henry made his way through the open workspace. Engineers who had been frantically pursuing dead-end solutions looked up from their monitors with expressions of palpable relief. The board meeting where Maxwell had presented Henry's conditions had been contentious. Several board members had balked at the comprehensive cultural changes Henry demanded, viewing them as excessive requirements to address what they considered a temporary technical challenge. But as Maxwell had laid out the stark reality of their situation, the complexity of the vulnerability, the approaching launch deadline, the competitive threat from Horizon, and the accelerating departure of key talent, resistance had gradually given way to reluctant acceptance. "Welcome back, Henry," the engineering director greeted him, the relief evident in his voice. "We've prepared the war room as you requested." Henry nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. I'd like to meet with the core architecture team first, then review all attempted solutions from the past week." Maxwell observed this exchange from a deliberate distance. Part of Henry's conditions had included operational autonomy, the freedom to address the technical challenges without executive interference or arbitrary constraints. For Maxwell, accustomed to maintaining tight control over all aspects of Vertex's operations, this requirement had been particularly difficult to accept. Yet here he stood, watching from the periphery, as Henry assumed leadership of the very crisis Maxwell's actions had precipitated. The initial architecture meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Henry methodically worked through the security vulnerability with the core engineering team. Unlike typical Vertex meetings, characterized by rapid exchanges and competitive energy, this session unfolded at a measured pace. Henry created space for each engineer to fully articulate their understanding and approach, asking probing questions without judgment or impatience. "The vulnerability isn't just in the authentication layer," Henry explained, sketching a diagram on the whiteboard. "It's in how the authentication layer interacts with the permission management system. The cross-service communication creates an exploit opportunity that isn't obvious when examining either system in isolation." As the day progressed, Maxwell found reasons to periodically walk past the glass-walled war room, observing Henry's approach with growing fascination. Where Maxwell had always led through decisive directives and ambitious targets, Henry guided through thoughtful questions and contextual insights. He didn't dominate the conversation or impose solutions. Instead, he created a collaborative environment where the team could leverage their collective intelligence more effectively. By evening, when most of Vertex's employees had departed, the war room remained fully staffed. Through the glass walls, Maxwell could see Henry at the whiteboard, surrounded by engineers whose expressions had transformed from defeated exhaustion to focused engagement. For the first time since the crisis began, progress was being made. "How's it going in there?" Maxwell asked the engineering director, who had stepped out briefly for coffee. "It's remarkable," the director admitted. "Henry helped us understand that we've been solving the wrong problem. The authentication vulnerability is actually a symptom of a more fundamental architectural issue. Once he reframed our understanding, Pathways to resolution started emerging. Maxwell nodded, processing this information. And the timeline? Henry believes we can implement a comprehensive fix within 2 weeks, followed by a week of rigorous testing. We'll still make the launch date, though with less margin than we'd prefer. Relief washed over Maxwell. 2 days earlier, facing the board's intense scrutiny, he had been fighting for his professional survival. Now, with Henry's return, the immediate crisis appeared to be resolving. Yet Maxwell found himself less focused on this tactical victory than on the leadership dynamics unfolding before him. On the second day of Henry's return, Maxwell made a decision that surprised his executive team. He canceled his morning meetings and stationed himself in the war room as an observer. He took a seat in the corner, remaining largely silent as Henry continued working with the engineering team. The gesture signaled a shift in Maxwell's approach, a willingness to learn rather than direct, to understand rather than dictate. What Maxwell witnessed throughout that day challenged many of his fundamental assumptions about effective leadership and innovation. Henry's methods were neither flashy nor revolutionary in the ways Silicon Valley typically celebrated. He didn't push for dramatic pivots or disruptive breakthroughs. Instead, he fostered an environment of methodical problem-solving, drawing on historical patterns while remaining open to novel approaches. "I've seen variations of this architectural challenge before," Henry explained to a younger engineer struggling with a particularly complex component. "In the early cloud transition, we faced similar cross-service authentication issues. The technologies have evolved, but the underlying principles remain consistent." This pattern repeated throughout the day, Henry connecting current challenges to historical contexts, not to impose outdated solutions, but to provide valuable reference points for innovation. He demonstrated how experience could accelerate rather than impede progress, offering shortcuts past already explored dead ends and highlighting patterns that might otherwise take years to recognize. By the third day, the war room had developed a rhythm and energy unlike anything Maxwell had previously observed at Vertex. The hierarchical dynamics that typically characterized the company's project teams had given way to a more fluid collaboration where ideas were evaluated on merit rather than source. Junior engineers offered suggestions that senior team members built upon. Expertise was respected regardless of title or tenure. Most striking to Maxwell was the change in the team's younger members. Engineers who had previously competed for visibility and recognition were now collaborating with genuine enthusiasm. They sought Henry's input not from obligation, but from recognition of its value. They listened to his guidance not because of his position, but because of his wisdom. "Your team is extraordinarily talented," Henry remarked to Maxwell during a rare moment when they found themselves alone in the break room. "They've been constrained not by ability but by culture, by the expectation that innovation must always be dramatic and disruptive, rather than sometimes methodical and evolutionary." Maxwell considered this observation thoughtfully. "I've built Vertex around speed and breakthrough thinking. It's been successful by most measures." "It has," Henry acknowledged, "but there are different kinds of success, achieved through different paths. The most resilient organizations balance multiple approaches rather than committing exclusively to one." On the fifth day of Henry's return, the engineering team successfully implemented a comprehensive solution to the security vulnerability. The fix wasn't flashy or revolutionary. It was elegant in its simplicity, addressing the root architectural issue while maintaining compatibility with existing components. When the first round of testing confirmed its effectiveness, spontaneous applause broke out in the war room. Maxwell, who had continued his daily observations, found himself joining in the celebration. The immediate crisis had been averted. Vertex Core 4.0 would launch on schedule, with security enhancements that could now be marketed as features rather than emergency patches. The exodus of talent had slowed as word spread of Henry's return and the positive changes unfolding within the engineering department. Yet, as Maxwell watched Henry receive congratulations from team members young and old, he recognized that resolving the security vulnerability represented only the beginning of the changes Henry's return had initiated. The deeper transformation, the reevaluation of Vertex's culture and Maxwell's own leadership philosophy, was just beginning. The technical crisis had been solved through Henry's expertise, but the cultural challenge Henry had identified remained. How Vertex would integrate the wisdom of experience with the energy of youth, how it would balance disruption with continuity, innovation with institutional knowledge? These questions would define the company's future far more profoundly than any single product launch. As the celebration continued around them, Henry caught Maxwell's gaze across the room. The older man offered a small nod of acknowledgement, not of victory or vindication, but of a shared understanding that their journey together had only just begun.